everyone, and welcome to our October live event with Heather Thomas. She's once again here to answer all of your quilting questions. So Heather, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, so we're going to get started. We have some questions that came in right off the bat, so we're going to get started with those first. And Janie wants to know what your opinion is on the need to tear off the ends of fabric and repress the fold line to make sure the fabric fold is on grain.
Oh, well, I think that can be kind of important. So yeah, pulling off the selvage edge, I assume that's what you're talking about. And I do pull those off. I clip a little bit and then rip them off because then it trues up that to the grain rather than cutting those off. And what happens a lot with fabrics, that selvage is woven a little bit tighter than the rest of the fabric. So if you don't take that off, it can distort your cutting along the way. And so if you're having a hard time with cutting, it could be because of those selvages. So that's a really great way to make sure that your cutting is a little more accurate, especially if you're doing a lot of long linear cutting, if you're cutting lines across from selvage to selvage, that you're doing strip piecing, that sort of thing. And yes, once you've ripped off those selvages, you definitely need to go back and repress that center fold because it's not going to be true any longer. The way fabrics are rolled and put on the bolt is not always going to be true to the grain, and you can't trust that. So even if you don't launder, you need to repress that center. So I am absolutely with you 100% on that. It's going to make your cutting more accurate every single time, especially if you're doing strip piecing, if you do bargellos and things like that. Very important.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Lorraine, and she says, would you use embroidery thread for quilting?
Hey Lorraine, I use embroidery thread all the time for quilting, but I'm not sure what kind of embroidery thread you're talking about. The answer is yes on both embroidery thread that is made for machine embroidery and embroidery thread that's made for hand embroidery. I use them in lots of different ways. I'll start with the machine embroidery thread, if that's what you're talking about. It's usually a 60 weight and it's 2-ply. It's most often cotton, but you can get it in silk also. The reason I like it is because it does a beautiful, beautiful micro stipple or any type of really close together stitching. Or anytime I'm doing any type of thread play that's not threads, that's not actual thread sketching or thread covering the whole area, if I want to add some thread in an area to build that area up a bit, I don't want the thread to be too heavy. So I like to use a thinner, lighter weight thread for that. So that's how I use that embroidery thread that is made for the machine. However, you can also use hand embroidery thread when you're quilting. You can use it to do big stitch quilting if you're hand quilting. You can even wind it onto your bobbin and do some bobbin play with it. And that is when you put your quilt up on your machine upside down and put that heavier thread in your bobbin and a lighter thread on top. And then you can stitch that way and end up with a much bulkier design that shows from the front. You wouldn't do that all over the whole surface of your quilt, but you can definitely do it to add some thick interest, say in the center of a flower or along the edge of something that kind of got lost and you want to make it look like it's more noticeable. So yeah, you can use both types of embroidery thread.
And do you worry about changing your needle at all when you're using embroidery thread?
Yes, that's a good idea. If you're using the really thin 60 weight, you definitely want to go to a thinner needle, a smaller needle. And so that needle is probably going to be about a size 60 or a 70. You can use an embroidery needle if you want to, but that's probably not the best idea. I would use a sharps or a top stitch needle.
Perfect. All right, we have another question that just came in, and this is from Randa. And she says, do you have any tips on handling the bulk of a quilt when machine quilting on your regular sewing machine?
Well, Randa, all I've ever done is quilt on my regular sewing machine. And this is one of the questions that I've helped students deal with a lot. I used to teach a lot of machine quilting classes. And one of the things that we do as humans is we get caught up with the whole thing and we forget to think about just the job in front of us. So one of the best things that you can do is make sure that you have your table that you're stitching on set up in an L formation. The table in front of you where the machine is would be the bottom leg of that L. And then to your left, if you're right-handed, and to your right, if you're left-handed, you want to have another table coming out to form an L, like a capital L. And that table that's on your side is going to be used to support the bulk of the quilt. And then you're going to have some portion of the quilt in your lap or up on your chest. You're going to be wearing parts of the quilt. Don't roll it up. Don't scrunch it up. You don't need to do any of those things. They come undone. They get too heavy. They get too cumbersome. Once you have that quilt laid up on that L formation table to support it, and you're supporting it with your upper body, then I want you to think about nothing but the portion that you're quilting. Pretend the rest of it doesn't even exist. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Don't get all flummoxed by it. Just think about the dinner plate size or the 18-inch long area or whatever it is you're about to stitch. Think about it. And as you're doing that and you're moving the quilt back and forth, if you're ever having to move it into the bed of the machine so that it comes up against the inner wall of the machine, try to do an accordion fold as you pull it into there. And then when you go to move in the opposite direction, you simply will unfold that accordion fold as you stitch, and then re-accordion fold as you stitch in, and then back and forth. Now, this is not a precise accordion fold. You're simply just kind of pulling it into that edge of the machine where the opening of the machine is, as where all your controls are. And this is a way to kind of handle the bulk that's underneath the machine. Remember, you can always knot off, reposition the quilt, turn it around as needed, and quilt in the opposite direction. You don't have to quilt from side to side. You can quilt from middle out. You don't have to handle the whole bulk of the whole quilt. You're the boss, applesauce. The quilt is not the boss of you. You're the boss of the quilt. Don't let it wrangle you. Don't let it get the best of you. And just try to think of just the job at hand. What's in front of me once I've got all that weight supported by something else.
Perfect. All right, our next question that just came in here is from Cindy. And she says, when quilting with minky, can you use rayon or polyester thread, or does that weaken it?
Well, nothing weakens minky. Minky's made out of plastic. So minky's a pretty strong fabric, okay? So in fact, your best bet to use with minky is going to be polyester. I don't know if you've heard my opinion on minky before, but you brought it up, so I'm going to have to tell you. If you're putting that minky on the quilts of little babies that you love, you want to remember that minky is made out of plastic, and when it gets near a heat source, it catches fire. So it might be soft and yummy and very launderable and all those things, but it's also kind of a danger. It's not rated to be in a nursery. You know how pajamas are rated for fire safety and all that. It's not rated to be in a nursery, so keep that in mind. But yeah, you can't use a strong enough thread for minky. Any of the threads are going to work, but generally speaking, in quilt making, we match the fiber. If we're quilting with silk fabrics, we can use silk threads, or any thread that is as not too strong, not stronger than silk. Well, there's nothing stronger than silk. But if we're using cotton, then when we use those threads that are a lot stronger than cotton, we can weaken the quilt in that manner. So kind of match those threads and you'll be good.
I think after you watch at least one or two of these live events, everyone's going to start to know your opinion on minky.
Yeah. And it's so hard because it's so slinky and wonderful and soft, but it's, you know, it's just so dangerous.
All right. And our next question here that just came in, this is from Linda. And she says that her Husqvarna Viking 960Q has both spring action and floating free motion settings. Is one better than the other, and why?
Well, you know, Linda, that is a very, it's an odd question and an interesting question and a new question, because, you know, these floating feet are, I think maybe 3 years in, we're into these floating feet. And my question to you is, how much experience do you have with one or the other? If you've never done either of them, in my opinion, the one with the spring action will help you control your quilt better. The floating foot kind of makes you feel like you have no control. The foot is never coming into contact with your quilt. It's hovering above your quilt. And so if you're jerky in your motions, there's nothing to stop that jerkiness. Whereas the spring action, because it's popping up and down all the time and constantly making contact with your quilt, actually helps give you more control. So if you've never quilted before, I would say go with the spring action to start. If you've quilted before and the spring action has not really helped you, or you feel like it hasn't helped you, or you feel like it's gotten in your way, then go with the floating. If you're fearful that if you get used to the spring action, 10 years from now, we're going to have nothing but floating, well, then go with the floating. I don't know what's going to happen. You know, I think it's interesting when something is brought to us by a manufacturer that maybe somebody asked for. I don't know whoever said, let's have our foot float when we free motion quilt so that we have absolutely no control. I've taught classes at big shows with machines that were provided from a machine company with nothing but floating feet. And the people who have never quilted before don't see a difference because they don't know what it is to have a spring action. But the people who have quilted before with spring action generally freak out because nothing is ever touching their quilt and it feels weird. So it just depends on your comfort level. If you've never done it before, give them both a try. If you're happier with that spring action, neither one is going to make you a better quilter if you've never quilted before. Practice is going to make you a better quilter if you've never quilted before.
Absolutely. And I know from personal opinion, trying that floating foot after getting used to the spring foot is definitely a lot different. And I don't have near the experience that you do, Heather, and that it totally threw me off. So
it's just loosey-goosey. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Our next question here is from Jill. And she says, since she's moved farther north, her family has asked if she could make her next quilts warmer. Normally I use warm and white natural batting. Would you suggest 2 layers of that or perhaps a bamboo cotton blend?
Neither. I definitely wouldn't suggest 2 layers. The quilt is going to become very heavy and cumbersome to quilt, number 1. And number 2, the bamboo isn't really going to help with the warmth either. Bamboo helps with longevity of the product. It helps with, it's greener, so it helps our environment. It has antimicrobial aesthetics to it, and it has a greater drape. That's what bamboo does. If you want warmth, you need to move to a wool or a wool blend or a silk blend. Those are the warmest battings. Both wool and silk have barbs in them, and those barbs interlock with each other and they trap heat. But because they're a natural fiber, they allow the quilt to breathe, and so you don't sweat under them. Polyester is the hottest of all battings, and it also has barbs in it, man-made barbs, and they interlock with each other. But because it's a man-made product, it's plastic and it catches on fire easily. Because of those barbs, though, it traps that heat, but it won't pull away moisture. It won't wick away moisture, and so you sweat underneath it. So I would never suggest that polyester, just from a comfort level above, the fact that it's dangerous. So if you want warmth, go for a fabulous wool or a wool blend, or a silk blend. Your wool is going to be less expensive. Quilter's Dream Cotton makes an amazing batting. I think it's called Empress or Orient. It's got an Asian kind of name to it, and it's got a mixture of cotton, bamboo, silk, and tencel. And tencel is rayon. It's a type of rayon. It's a cellulose-based material, and it is wonderfully warm, easy to quilt, beautifully drapes. It is my favorite batting for any quilt I'm going to love on. So that's what I go to when I want to add warmth to a quilt.
All right. Our next question is from Gloria. She says, I have a problem ending my threads on machine quilting. How do you end your threads?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And if you, for all you ladies out there who ever think you want to make competition quilts or quilts that are going to be put in a show, or quilts that are for decorative purposes more so than using purposes, there's different ways to basically knot off. And that's K-N-O-T-O-F-F, knot off. People think I'm saying knot off, like take a nap, but knot off. And so I'm going to start from the fanciest and kind of go down. But first I'm going to say that for most people, we get to the point where we understand that our knot offs, we're going to have to kind of put up with one thing so that we can get another, or put up with another so that we can get the one thing. If we want a really, really, really sturdy knot on a quilt that we're going to give to our grandson, who's going to drag it around the house and make forts with it and, hopefully take it off to college, then that knot is probably going to end up being more noticeable. If we want a knot that is simply going to finish that seam line and not show it all, because that quilt is going to go into a competition, we're hoping to get it into Houston next year, we're going to tie a different type of knot. So if you are a competitive quilter or thinking about being a competitive quilter, you might want to consider hand tying off all of your ends. which means that when you're done stitching, you take one little back stitch, only one, and that temporarily tacks that thread into place. And then you leave the thread very long. And when you're done with stitching, let's say a 2 foot by 2 foot area, any threads that you have that need to be knotted off, you're going to put onto a hand quilting needle, and you're going to tie a hand quilting knot, which is a knot that's very, very close to the surface. And then you're going to pull that knot through the surface of the fabric and nuzzle it through the batting so that it gets stuck in the batting, and then pull the excess thread through and then clip it off close to the surface. And that's called burying your knots. Those are what competitive quilters do, because judges will feel the surface of your quilt. And if they can feel any beginnings or ends or knots, they'll tell the scribe who's writing for them, you know, tell the maker to be careful of her starts and stops. And basically she's saying, I can feel your knots and I don't want to. But that's a very decorative knot, and it's not as sturdy as a really good, you know, hard machine knot. I tend to make my knots, I'm a little leery of my quilts going out in the world and the knots coming undone. And almost everything I've ever made is for sale. So I want to make sure that that thread is not going to come undone. I don't care if you can see the knot the tiniest little bit, but usually you can't. So what I do is I stop where I'm stopping, wherever I'm finished quilting, I stop, and then I hold my quilt in place with my left hand, and I push it down to the base of the machine. And with the right hand, I grab the quilt right next to where that is close to the machine, the bed of the machine, where the thread or the needle's going through the quilt. And I jiggle, I'm going to use my hand here, I'm going to jiggle it back and forth ever so slightly, like I've got a trimmer. So I'm not even really moving my hand. It's a jiggle back and forth like I've got a trimmer. And I take 2 or 3, maybe 4 little stitches, fast stitches as I do that. And what I'm doing is I'm taking such tiny stitches right next to each other that there's no way I can get them out with a seam ripper. And that's what I'm looking for. If I can easily get them out with a seam ripper, then they're not really tight enough and they're going to be noticeable. So I'm trying to make these, yeah, just minute little knots. If your knot ends up being too big and noticeable, that's kind of not very attractive. And so I've been known, if I ended up with a big ugly knot, to cut the knot off and then start restitching, go back stitch start about 10 inches, 2 inches before I ended, tie my regular knot, come back to the end and try that knot again. I don't like to have to do that, but if it ends up really ugly, I will. So I generally go a little bit beyond and have a slightly more noticeable knot so that I know that knot's never going to come out. And I never, ever hand tie off, because my life is just way too short. I'm too old for that. So it's up to you, you know, how much time you have for that. But that's the fancy way. Hope that helps.
All right, our next question here is from Peggy. She says, every time I start to stitch something, a bunch of thread gathers underneath. How do I prevent this?
Now, see, different machines have, it's just like different cars have different ways of pulling away from a stop sign, if you will. And if you've ever been in a quilt class, you might have seen some ladies who have a little piece of fabric that they use. It's called, like some people call it a feeder. And they'll feed that through first and stitch it before they feed their fabric in that they're going to piece. And what happens is that all the little gnarly bits that happen at the beginning of your sewing happens on that little feeder bit. And they'll use it over and over and over again until it's just so full of thread they can't use it anymore. And that's simply because of the way, it's called a take-up mechanism. That's the way their take-up mechanism works on their machine. It's not the smoothest take-up mechanism. One of the ways you can prevent that from happening, instead of using that leader, because for me, I don't want to have to pick something up and do something before I stitch. Instead, what I do, and because I've always had a machine that had a problem with the uptake, and it was a very high-end name brand machine, but it still had that problem, and I don't care. It just means I have to learn how to master whatever it is my machine does. And so instead, I simply would pull my top and bottom threads a little longer than most people do and wrap them, just one wrap around my finger, so I'm holding them when I take off with my first line of stitching. And it sounds like, oh, that's kind of a pain too, but once you get used to it, you find yourself doing it without even knowing that you're doing it. And what that does is it puts a little added tension on the ends of those threads so that your first stitches when you sew are nice stitches and you don't get all those little gnarly bits. So hope that helped.
Awesome. I just want to remind anyone out there, if you're just tuning in or maybe you've been watching from the beginning, if you have any questions, go ahead and submit those to Heather to answer. We're going to be live for about the next 40 minutes, and you can do that by typing your question into the comment section underneath this video. So we're going to keep moving through questions now. Our next one is from Linda. She says, I'm learning free motion quilting with my FOF machine, but continue to have the thread shredding above the needle. It doesn't do this when sewing straight lines. I've tried different threads, changing needles more often. Do you have any suggestions for her?
There's could be so many different things going on. It could be just a slight adjustment in your upper thread tension would be enough to make this not happen. And when I mean slight, most people have numbers or lines between their tension settings, and I'll pretend it, for lack of not knowing your machine, that you have numbers. And so let's say you have it normally set on 5 and you want to loosen your upper tension. Then you're going to not just ram it down to 2. That's a drastic change. Instead, you're going to put it down to 4 3/4 and see what happens. And if that's not enough, go down to 4 1/2. Any more than that, it's probably going to change the quality of your stitch. And we're going to have to say, well, it's not a tension issue. You say you're changing your needles, but I don't know if you're changing them because they're dull and they need to be changed because you sewed on them for a while, or if you're changing the size of the needle or the style of the needle. If you're stitching with a needle that is too small for your thread, that thread is going to shred before it goes through the needle. And that is the most classic reason why threads break. So if you're sewing with a 40 weight quilting thread, you need to be using a size 90 needle. And most people sew with a size 80 needle, and that difference can be enough to cause thread to shred. And that can really help you, is changing to a larger size. Also, the type of needle. The size is simply telling you how big the shank of the needle is, and therefore how big the hole can be in that shank, because a tiny little shank can't have a big hole. The shank has to get bigger, and then the hole gets bigger. But it doesn't tell you the shape of that hole. And certain needles have different shapes in them, and certain needles have different shapes of basically this line that runs down that needle that allows the thread to run into that line and smoothly run through that eye of the needle. So top stitch is my favorite needle to quilt with, and the main reason is because it's got a elongated oval opening in the eye. It hasn't got a sharp point to the end of the opening, so it's not a pointed opening, and it's not a little round opening. That elongated oval really helps that thread slip through that eye of that needle much smoother. So my first thing would be to change the needle size and type. So go to a needle that works with the size of thread that you need, and the bigger your thread is, the bigger your needle needs to be. The bigger your thread is, unfortunately, the lower the number is. The bigger your needle is, the higher the number is. Most of us stitch with 50 weight thread when we piece, and we have an 80 needle. And then we move to a 40 weight, which is a heavier thread for quilting, but we forget about changing our needle, or we change our needle to what we think is a bigger size, a 60, but that's a smaller needle. We need to change it to a bigger needle. So a 90 is a great thing to machine quilt with. And that top stitch has that wonderful eye shape that really makes the thread feed smoother. If neither of those things work, then it can be the way that your thread is coming off of the spool. So it depends what kind of spool feed you have. And if you're having a problem with the way your thread is feeding, it could be that you simply need to turn your spool around, because it's actually getting caught somewhere on that spool and you can't see it happening because you're stitching so fast. So that's another option. There's all these little things that you can try. And then the final thing is, some machines do not like some brands of thread, and regardless of what weight of thread it is. So if you find that every time you're sewing with brand A, it breaks, but when you sew with brand B, it only breaks every once in a while, well, every once in a while is normal. So I would stay away from brand A, even if it's a fabulous brand. It just means that the way that your machine was put together, its tolerances aren't happy with that thread. Hope that helps.
So there's a bunch of suggestions, lots of things to try. So yeah, hopefully one of those will fix her problem. All right, our next question here is from Grace, and she says she's wondering if anyone has ever used fleece as quilt batting. It is cheaper, warmer, and has more loft.
Well, fleece, like minky, is from the devil and smells like smoke, is highly, highly flammable. So that's a negative for me. Fleece also has a very unusual, what we would call hand to it. And it's going to be a little bit lumpy under the surface between those two layers of fabric, especially in any area where the fabric is thinner. It also is a very cheap fabric. So it's made poorly, and the likelihood of it lasting as long as the fabrics on the outside of your quilt, I have no idea of. Our battings are made to last a long time. They're manufactured in such a way that their fibers interlock with each other so that we know they're going to hold up. It wasn't this way 50 years ago, but it's certainly this way now. My grandmother used to use wool army blankets for her battings. A nightmare, because there's this wonderful thing called moths. But your best bet is to, if you're trying to cut corners financially, if quilting is too expensive, which is a very expensive hobby, but what I always tell people is buy the best that you can afford and simply make fewer quilts. Make quilts that are gonna just really be good for the person using them. They're going to warm them and be long lasting for them and protect them, rather than try to make a whole bunch of quilts cheaply from products that may not last very long and may not be safe for them in the long run. And kind of follow some of the standards. The standards are there because they're healthy for the industry, not just financially, but for the people who are using these products.
Perfect. All right, our next question that just came in here is from Laura. And she says she wants to know if you have any suggestions as to how to measure fabric to accurately cut long borders. I just never seem to be able to get them just right.
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you something here when it comes to those borders. Those borders can be a booger to cut. So you're not the only person who struggles with that. And I got to the point that for me, about 90% of the time, I ripped my borders because I know they're going to rip on grain. And Ashley's eyes got all big when I said that. Yeah. Unfortunately, every year it seems that a lot of our fabrics become of a lower quality. The manufacturers are cutting corners so that they can keep the prices lower for the consumer who is tired of paying a high price for fabric. So a lot of the really big name companies are making fabrics that if you rip them, they end up with these white lines that go all the way, maybe even an inch into that rip. So they can't be ripped. So it's not a possibility. If you're using a batik, no problem, rip that puppy and it's going to just rip perfectly for you. However, that being said, if you can't do that, you're going to have to cut. So the most important thing that you want to do with those borders is make sure that they're true to grain. And that's really the only part of the quilt that I think is important that is true to the grain. Any other parts of the piecing in the interior of the quilt, unless it's a long, long strip of sashing, can be anywhere. I mean, we've been making quilts from scraps for hundreds of years that, all the woman who made them cared about was the piece big enough, not was it going to be on grain. And I'm not saying that that's the perfect way to make a quilt. I'm saying it's an acceptable way to make a quilt. So let's get back to that border. So the first thing you want to do is you want to remove the selvages because they're going to distort your cutting. And you want to make sure that your fabric is folded accurately so that when you remove those selvages, you refold the fabric so the selvages line up. And then if you have to refold it again, refold it so that the fold lines up with the lined up selvages. This is really important. Those folds all have to be accurate. Then when you set that down on your cutting board, you're going to use the lines on your cutting board. And that's one of the only times I ever use the lines on my cutting board. I don't use them when I'm cutting small units. I use my ruler for that. But with this, you want to make sure that you can set the fold line of the big basic folded up portion of fabric on a straight line and make sure that your selvage is true to a straight line. It may not lie directly on a straight line, but you want to be able to use a ruler in there and see that it's true to a straight line. and then you can begin your cutting. You want to make sure after you've cut one that you make sure that it is true. Lay it out along your cutting board and make sure it hasn't got any wonky areas where the folds were, because if it has one, then every single border you're going to cut after that is going to have one. If it does have a slight wonkiness to it, go ahead and use it, but true that remaining fabric up first. Again, try to get it truer before you make the next cut. If you find that you end up with wonkiness, you can, recut that border and try to get rid of some of that and make that border slightly thinner, because it's better to lose a ½ inch of border width than to have a really wonky border and sew it on so that it's got an area where it has a dimple in, because once it's got that dimple in, you're kind of stuck with that dimple. One little trick that I do, just so you know, when it comes to borders on quilts, especially with bigger quilts, I always cut my borders about a ½ inch too short. You want to measure across the center of your quilt, vertically and horizontally, to get the measurement for those borders. And so if my border needs to be exactly 82½ inches, I'm going to cut it 82¼ And then I'm going to pin the two ends in the middle, and I'm going to ease everything in. What happens when I do this is I never end up with a wavy edge. Never, because your fabric stretches as you piece it. And if it's even a little bit too big, you're going to end up with a wavy edged quilt. So always err on the side of it being a slight bit too small. But just keep those folds really, really straight. It's the only thing that you can do. It takes some manipulation. Yeah.
Yep. And you know how I feel. It's always about cutting fabric, never tearing. All right.
Here I say rip.
Yeah, we're exact opposites. I know. All right, our next question here is from Nicole, and she says that she would like to make a fall quilt and combine cotton flannels with quilting cottons. I've purchased a plaid flannel for the backing of the quilt as well. Do I need to pre-shrink flannels and cotton, or just the flannels?
If you're going to pre-shrink one, you need to pre-shrink the other. You got to pre-shrink everything that you're using, unless you're looking for some funky, weird result, because that's what you're going to get, is some funky, weird result. So yeah, either pre-shrink both or don't pre-shrink either. And remember that plaid, if it's a woven plaid, if it's a true woven plaid, meaning that it was thread woven, each thread that makes up the plaid was its color before it got woven together, then you'll be able to get that fabric true to the grain on the back of that quilt. But if it's a printed plaid, meaning that the design was printed onto the surface of that flannel, and you're using that for the back of your quilt, you're going to be hard pressed to make sure that grid is straight and true on the back of the quilt. So give it up. Just let it not be straight, because you'll drive yourself crazy, because they're never printed straight on the between the two selvages and blah. So hopefully for you, it was yarn dyed. It was woven with the colors that made up the plaid. But yeah, if you're going to wash one, you got to wash them both. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here comes in from Becky. She says, when bordering blocks, do you add the sides first, or do you add the top and bottom border first?
Whatever you want to do, Becky, as long as you do it consistently. So, if it's a block and you're talking about just putting a border around it and then the blocks get sewn to each other and nothing else is in between them, then you can always just turn it. You put the two sides on first, and then you put the top and bottom, and then the next one you put the top and bottom, and you put the two sides, turn the block, unless the block's directional, of course, then you couldn't do that. But so whatever you do, do it consistently, so that when you lay those quilts out, the seams are lining up in the same way. So you can always go top, bottom, side, side, or you can always go side, side, top, bottom. It's really up to you. It shouldn't affect the functionality of the quilt in any way, shape, or form, but it will affect the visual of how those lines of the seam are coming together, and it may affect your quilting in the long run. If you're doing some long stitching in the ditch and you end up with a block twisted or turned differently from everything else, you may not be able to stay in the ditch. So just be consistent one way or the other.
All right. Our next question here is from Gay, and he says, what do you think of putting a product on the back of rulers to help hold them still? If you like them, which product do you recommend?
Well, I use Omni Grip rulers. That's OMNIGRIP. and it's got a little sandpapery section every so often on the ruler to keep that from happening. However, that being said, I started with Omni grid rulers that have no type of grip. And I know a lot of people are caught up with the idea of grip, but I'm going to tell you one of the negative sides of anything with grip on fabric. You have to lift that ruler up and move it to make the next cut because of that grip. Otherwise, it pulls the fabric, and then you end up having to refold your fabric or relayer or whatever. So there are some negative sides to having that grip. If there's no grip on it, you can slide your ruler into the next position and cut, slide and cut, slide and cut. I assume that the reason that you want some sort of grip on your ruler is to keep it from moving. And one of the reasons that it moves is because of the way we hold that ruler. So if you're holding your ruler with a flat hand, meaning you're putting your flat hand down right here on the ruler and then putting pressure on it, anytime you do that, it puts pressure to move it. So you're actually causing your own trouble. And so there's this magic little grip you can use. You open up your fingers and you place your thumb and your first three fingers on the ruler, and you put your pinky on the edge of the ruler so that it's touching the ruler and the fabric at the same time. And I call it the spider grip. So you look like a long-legged spider. Your hand is not flat. It's up like this. It's also much more relaxing, doesn't sound like it is, for your hand. When you do this, what you do is you displace the pressure that you're putting on the ruler, and it doesn't slip nearly as often. In fact, it really doesn't slip at all. And then you don't need any anti-slip stuff underneath there. But if for some reason that doesn't even work for you, because, you know, not everything works for everybody, then yeah, stick some anti-stick stuff underneath there. You can get these little, the ones I think that are the best, they look like little clear rubber polka dots. And they have a very sticky on them. And that I think is the best because it doesn't really impede any of the lines, and the rubber grips really well. It also gives a little bit of give to the ruler. And that seems to make the cutting a little bit more comfortable. So I would go with those clear plastic or rubbery discs that you can stick to the bottom if I was going to use anything at all. But try that hand grip instead first and see if that doesn't make your cutting a little bit more accurate and your ruler move around a lot less.
Absolutely. And if you want a more, I guess, a different visual on that hand grip, Heather did just recently do a video for us on that where she demonstrates exactly what she was just saying with that spider grip. That should be up on the website soon, so you'll be able to see that again to see exactly what she's talking about. All right, our next question here is from Yvonne, and she says, what is the easiest way to bind a quilt? I have difficulty putting it on once I have completed my quilt project.
The easiest way to bind a quilt is to do it over and over and over again until you get really good at it. Binding is one of the hardest things for a lot of people, and it's one of those things that can really make or break a quilt. So my suggestion would be to watch some of the videos on this site on binding. There are a couple different videos from different people. There are lots of different ways that people use to start or end. There are lots of different ways that people use to measure for their bindings. I'm old school. Whatever I learned and it worked for me is what I tend to stick with. I've always used a double French binding, which is 2 layers that are folded down the middle. I always sew the binding to the front of the quilt using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and pull the binding all the way to the back and hand stitch it on. If I want to machine stitch the binding on, then I do the opposite. I sew it to the back of the quilt by machine, roll it over to the front, and then machine quilt it down. That way I have a really good visual and I know how the front of the quilt is going to look. But my suggestion would be to, here on this site, to look up double French binding, or if you don't find what you're looking for here, go to YouTube and you'll probably find one of our videos there if you put in the words double French binding. And it'll give you some help. And then just practice quilting on some practice quilting blocks and practice binding those quilted blocks and hone your skill. None of this stuff comes easily for any of us. The ones of us that are good at it, it's only because we did it and did it and did it and then we did some more.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here comes from someone who is watching all the way from Scotland, and apparently it is 1:30 a.m. there. So thank you so much for tuning in. But she says she is new to quilting and have trouble with sewing long seams when sewing strips together to make a large piece, which she would then cut to make pieces. Mm-hmm. The piece starts to warp. I've bought a walking foot to try to rectify this. Should I be sewing from the same end each time, or should I alternate ends to try to sort this? what kind of suggestions do you have for her?
Yeah, I don't think a walking foot is going to rectify this at all. Walking feet are not meant to feed 2 pieces of fabric. Walking feet are meant to feed 3 pieces of fabric. There are lots of machines out there that have built-in, they call them built-in walking feet, but that's not really what they are. They're dual feed feet that are made to help feed 2 pieces of fabric. And there's a big difference between a dual feed foot and a walking foot. A walking foot jumps around a little too much because that's what it does. It walks like this, and it will really distort your seams. So there are better ways. There are much better ways. My favorite way is moleskin. So moleskin is what you put it on your feet. It's got a sticky back of it. You put it on your feet if you've got a corn or something that hurts your foot so that it doesn't rub against the inside of your shoe. And it is about 1/8 of an inch tall. And you can get some that's even up to like 1/4 of an inch tall, and it will stick to your machine. So you cut a strip of it and you put it right where your 1/4 inch seam line is. And basically what it does is it gives you a hard edge that's raised to push your fabric against. And if you make sure that your fabric is touching that moleskin at all times, not sliding off to one side, not climbing up on top of it, but running right against the edge of that moleskin at all times, you're going to increase the accuracy of that 1/4 inch seam. It gives you an edge to work off of. And it will, I used to use it when I taught kids how to quilt. And I would tell them that the fabric needs to hug the moleskin. And I walk by around in the classroom going, are you hugging? Are you hugging? Remember to make that fabric hug that moleskin. And that means it's just skimming right along. It's just touching it. And it's a great way to increase your accuracy. And then the other thing is slow down. Slow down. We all sew so fast. And when we're sewing that fast, we lose our accuracy. Try to find a speed that you can be comfortable at, that you know that you're not, wasting your time by sewing, two stitches a minute, but a little slower than you're probably going now, and keep your speed consistent, just like you would with machine quilting. That will help with the accuracy of those long stitches too. For years, I made bargellos all the time, and you're doing all these long strip sets. And when you're doing something that has a lot of strip sets, you also ask, should I sew at the same end all the time? The answer is no. There's a 2Z-4Z method. So if you have like 8 rows that you're going to be sewing together, you sew the first 2 both from end A, and the second 2 together from end A, and the next 2 together from end A. But when you sew those together, the first group of 2 to the second group of 2, you want to start at end B. And what happens is this keeps it from becoming almost a coil, because if you don't, it'll start to coil up. So it's called the 2Z-4Z method. When you sew the 2 together, you sew from one end. When you sew the 4 together, you sew from the other end. When you go back to sewing the 8 together, you go to the first end. And when you sew the 16 together, you go back to the second end. And you just go back and forth from end to end so that you have a nice flat strip set.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is someone wants to know, they say, I love quilting, but they cannot do stippling. Can you help? Well,
if you can't do stippling, you're probably not here, so you can't tell me the answer to this question, but most human beings are either classics or romantics when it comes to their sensibilities. And those sensibilities mean the way they move through the world, the way they dance, play sports, decorate their homes. And classics have a really hard time with stippling, because stippling is soft and curvy and dancey, and their stippling always looks kind of angled and messy, and they have a hard. What's going on, Ashley?
Because you're describing me perfectly. Like, I have a problem with stippling because I am not. I cannot like let go and just do it.
So if you have a hard time with that curvy stipple, quit trying to do the curvy stipple and move to a different type of stipple. Move to a square stipple. Move to an angled stipple. You can. I've done lots of videos that show those here on this. I'm sure you can find them. Can they Google in a word onto the site, do a search?
Absolutely. There is a search bar at the top. Yep, you can put a word in.
So put in square stipple, and it'll take you to that. And instead of doing curves that are gentle and soft and flowy, you're going to be doing lines with hard angles on it, which may be what comes naturally to you, because maybe you're a classic and you're beating yourself up for not being able to stipple, and it's really not part of your body language. So whenever you're learning to machine quilt, whatever comes naturally to you is what you should practice most in the beginning until you feel really, really confident with it. Then start adding in those things that are a little bit more difficult. Once you've already got that confidence level, then you're going to find that you're a little better at them than you were when you tried to do them in the beginning. So if you're struggling with stippling, then to heck with stippling, do something else. Do something else. There's hundreds and hundreds of possibilities. Don't beat yourself up either, because it's just a stipple.
Yeah, I'm glad to know that I'm in a category now, and there's others out there like me. We're all classics.
Yeah, you're classics. And I'm just a big old romantic, so.
All right. Our next question here is from Margaret, and she says, I'm new to quilting, but I want to learn to hand quilt. Where can I find good information on this?
You know, there are lots of great books out there on hand quilting. One of my favorite books is by Alex Anderson. She wrote all of her books are just, they're so geared right to the beginner, and she speaks in English and not quiltese, and so they're easy for you to understand. When I first started quilting, I met Alex Anderson at a quilt show one time, and she was selling frames that her father used to make. I don't know if he still makes them or not, but and that woman can hand quilt in every direction, meaning she can hand quilt moving with her push finger and her thumb towards her, or her push finger and her thumb away from her, which most people can't do. This woman is an amazing hand quilter, and you probably know her from the quilt show that she does with Ricky Timms. But it's that Alex Anderson, and I know her book is still available on hand quilting. And if I was going to recommend any book, it would be hers. And then remember one very important thing: don't make the mistake of saying, "Well, I'm going to use a bigger needle in the beginning because it's easier." If you want small, tight stitches, then you need to start with a small needle. If you start with a big needle, your stitches are going to be bigger. And when you want to go down to smaller stitches, you have to go down to a smaller needle. You basically have to learn the whole thing all over again. The motion's the same, but because the distance is different, it's like you feel almost retarded when you're trying to learn, because you're like, why can't I do it with this little needle? So just start with a little needle in the first place if you want little stitches. If you want big stitches, just go for big stitches, because big stitch quilting is quite popular right now. But yeah, Alex Anderson, beginning hand quilting, that's the way to go in my opinion.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is kind of a general question, but I think you've done a little bit with this. But Carol wants to know how you do photo quilting or add photos to quilts.
Oh, there's so many different ways to transfer photos, and some are really good ways, and some are really yucky ways. What I'm going to say is that there are products out there for putting photos onto fabric, and in this avenue, the more money you spend, the better it's going to be. I hate to say that, but the cheaper products have a looser weave, and the photos end up looking a little bit pixelated when you're done, and they show every needle hole when you stitch around or in that photo. So you want to stick with a product that's really good. The one's called, I think it's called Timeless Treasures, I think is probably the best one. You can also use Bubble Jet Set to make your own fabric that will make photographs pretty much permanent when you put them through a printer. There is a product called, TAP, T-A-P, that will transfer photos onto fabric. And when you first do that, you're going to go, ooh, that's icky and rubbery and weird. But the first time you wash it, it becomes soft and wonderful and fabulous. But it's pretty darn pricey, but it's worth it. You can needle through it beautifully. So yeah, there are some great products out there. I would ask my local quilt store if they carry anything, and if they do, ask them what they know about that product. If they don't know anything about it, Google it here or Google it on YouTube to get some, real specific information. But yeah, there's lots of products out there to do that with.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Newbie, and they say, how do you measure properly when an edge is cut with pinking shears?
You cut off that pinking shear edge first. That's really the only way to do it. There's no reason to have a pinking sheared fabric in a quilt. In fact, it's probably pretty detrimental, because that pinking shear angle is going to come into your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you need that 1/4 inch seam allowance, especially in these days with some of the very loosely woven fabrics that we're using these days. I would not include a pinking sheared edge in my quilt, none of my piecing. Yeah.
So what if you bought like a pre-cut, like the jelly rolls, and those are usually pinked on the edges? Is that going to affect you? You won't be able to use the size that you bought?
I wouldn't use them.
Yeah.
I would true those squares up first. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question here is from Denise, and she says, I'm a new quilter, so I'm not exactly sure if my question is relevant, but can I mix regular cottons with batiks?
Absolutely. I started quilting before batiks were available in the quilting market. And when they first came out, everybody just was like, wow, these are so weird and so different. Yes, they are more tightly woven than our regular fabrics. Yes, they don't shrink as much as our regular fabrics. If you're not a pre-washer, you could run into some issues with that. Let's take a fabric whose manufacturer whose gray goods, that's spelled G-R-E-I-G-E, I think, and that is the fabric before it's been printed on, the gray goods, is very loosely woven most of the time, and that's Moda. If we put a Moda fabric in with a batik fabric, we can have some issues because the Moda is going to stretch and move for us, and the batik isn't going to stretch and move for us. Does that mean we can't use them together? No, it simply means that we have to remember that when I'm working with fabric, I'm the boss of the fabric. It's an inanimate object, and I get to tell it what to do, and I'm responsible for that. So if I'm going to feed a batik and a cotton together at the same time, I'm going to put the one that stretches more on top because I don't want it to get pulled by those feed dogs. So I'm going to put my Moda on top and my batik on the bottom when I feed them through, if I can. And that will keep them from distorting more or them from not fitting together as well. But yeah, you can absolutely use any fabric together that you want to. You know, fabric's fabric. You can use a batik, you can use a silk, you can use a flannel with a cotton, you can use any of those things with a cotton. My grandmother used to make quilts out of her husband's old shirts and double knit. You know, where there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here is from Charlene. She says that she has a few yards of beautiful silk fabric that her brother brought from his tour of duty in Vietnam back in the 70s. She's always been too intimidated to cut into it to make anything. She'd like to make some sort of wall hanging or mini quilt with it, but not sure what other fabrics would work with it or if it's even quiltable. Any suggestions?
Well, there's lots of different types of silk, I'm not as familiar with Vietnamese silk as I am with some of the other silks, like Thai silk. The very first thing I would do is I would launder it. And if you're going to put it into a quilt that's going to be used by a human, wrapped around them, touched, then I would launder it by hand with water. If I am going to put it into a wall quilt, then I would probably have it dry cleaned. But no matter what you do, you need to clean it, because if it's been sitting around that long, it's got all kinds of things on its surface, even if you don't see it. Sloughed off skin, dust, dirt, could even have mites. Anything that's been sitting around for a long time that's cloth is going to have some issues. So first, let's start with it clean. After that, you can mix any fabric you want to with it. I use silk a lot, and I mix it with cottons. I mix it with silk rayons. I mix it with rayons. I'll mix it with anything. If it's a slinky silk, meaning that it's in constant motion, when you lay it down and try to fold it on top of itself to cut it and it slinks and moves about, then I would put a permanent, very lightweight, non-woven, iron-on interfacing on the back side of it. And that will make it behave just like cotton. And in fact, if you want to use it with heavier weight fabrics, if it's a really light or sheer fabric, if it doesn't move around a lot, putting that interfacing on will help it behave like other cottons and make it easier to work with. I will put that type of interfacing on any fabric that's misbehaving, because I don't like dealing with misbehaving fabric. So I will make it behave because I'm the boss of the fabric. It is not the boss of me. So yeah, you can use that with any type of fabric that you want to. And I think it would be great to use it as a decorative piece, a wall piece. Mix it up with whatever you want, and use it up, because you know he brought it back for you as a gift, and don't be afraid of it. It's just some fabric. You'll be fine.
I think that needs to just be the theme of tonight's live event is you're the boss of your fabric.
You're the boss, applesauce.
Yes.
You enter your studio. It is the only place in the whole world. But when you enter your studio, you are the boss of everything. You're the boss of everything in there. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. We got about 5 minutes left. So our next question here is from Lynn. And she says, if you had a seam with light and dark fabric and the pattern was such that you should press the seam on the light, would you follow the pattern or would you follow the rule to press the seam to the dark so it didn't show up on the light fabric?
Well, Lynn, I'm gonna kind of go back further than that. When I'm selecting fabrics that if I know I'm doing something like, let's say the lightest and the darkest, black and white, I'm gonna make sure that my white fabric is heavy, that it's probably heavier than my black fabric, so that when I get to that position, I'm not gonna be able to see that black through. If I see a little shadowing, just so that it's basically a darker white, that's okay with me. That's going to happen once I get the batting behind there anyway. But if I see so much black through my white that I see gray, then I know that I'm not going to use those two fabrics together because one can't hold its own against the other. Because we never know when we're piecing when we might have to switch the direction of something and the seams. And so I want to know that nothing's going to show through. But let's say you've already got a lot of it pieced and you have one area where you know you need to move it in a different direction, that seam in a different direction. Then what you want to do is you want to go in and undercut that black seam, meaning that you're not going to cut it so short that there's no seam allowance in the black at all or the dark at all, but that it's a little bit shorter than the white so that it never comes past that white, so that you're not going to really see it through the single layer of the light. You're only going to see it through that second or that double layer of the light. And that's called undercutting. And it's a booger to have to do that to a whole bunch of pieces. So more importantly, next time, if you're using a design or a pattern that requires a lot of lights and darks, make sure that those lights can hold their own against those darks. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, next question here is from Joanna. She says, when I try to sew triangles together, they never match up. What am I doing wrong?
You're sewing triangles, that's why. Most of us don't sew triangles together when we're sewing together triangles. Instead, we sew together squares and then cut them in half so that they yield triangles afterwards. So if I were you, what I would do is I would look up, again, here on this site, half square triangles, sewing half square triangle units, or quarter square triangle units, because that's what we call them in the industry. Half square triangles, it's a goofy name, or quarter square triangles. And you're going to have lots of different techniques that come up to sew those triangles together where you're never sewing together two triangles, okay? So that's the goal, is to never have to sew together two triangles to sew together two triangles. I know that sounds goofy, but it's better to sew together two squares and then cut them in half diagonally and yield two blocks that have two triangles sewn together. It's going to be a lot more accurate. So that's your goal, is to find one of those techniques. There's umpteen of them out there.
Perfect. All right. We got time for one more question here. Simple one here from Sherry, and she says, what do you do with a bobbin that has leftover thread from your last project? It's not enough for a new project and it's the wrong color. Seems like a waste to throw it away.
Well, Sherry, I'm just here to tell you, you don't have enough bobbins in your life. Those of us who've been sewing for a long time, I had 2 machines for a while, and for each of those machines, I had over 200 bobbins, okay? So that I never had to pull thread off a bobbin. And you're going to get used to how a thread feels and looks so that you don't have to put a little note on that bobbin that says this is a 50 weight cotton. You're going to know it's a 50 weight cotton when you compare it against some other ones. So you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff either. But I had bobbin cases for both of my machines that held 20 bobbins, and I separated them out by color. So when I was sewing, you know, something red, I could grab my red and orange bobbins and grab the closest red and use that. It didn't have to be an exact match. It just needed to be, you know, a close match. So instead of, you know, unwinding those threads off your bobbins, go buy yourself some more bobbins, baby, because everybody needs at least 20 or 30 or 40 or 100 bobbins for the machine.
Absolutely. I think I might not have enough. I think I might need to go shopping.
Yeah.
All right. Well, just a little update. We're at the end of the hour. Thank you for asking or answering all of the questions that everybody asked. But a lot of people, and we've had questions in past live events that want to know what you're doing, because you haven't been making a lot of quilts lately.
I have not been making a lot of quilts lately. I'm making a couple little pieces that I call, that have fabric in them, that I call wall jewelry, but mostly I'm making jewelry. And I have become a metalsmith, and I'm very, very excited about it. And so I want to invite all of you to come check out what I've been doing, because today my website went live. And so you can see what I've been up to by going to wildheatherdesign.com. So it's just wildheatherdesign.com, and check out what I've been doing. And you're going to find, especially if you go to the engraving section, all kinds of things that I'm doing now with metal that I used to do with fabric, if you can believe that. So yeah, it's really cool.
It's some pretty cool stuff in here. I have problems stippling on a quilt, and she can quilt on metal. I don't know how it's done.
I love stippling on metal. So yeah. Thanks so much, Ashley.
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope you tune in again next month for our next live event. Have a good night.
All right. Thanks.